Retro Hangover is supported via Patreon by listeners like you. We would especially like to thank patrons Lyle McCarnes, Ashton Ruby, and Randall. Your continued engagement and generous donations are deeply appreciated.
Open your ears and crack some beers. You are listening to episode 78 of Retro Hangover.
Hello, retro and classic gamers. Welcome to the podcast where we are dangerous Dungeness dragons daringly driving dookie dangaroos. This is episode 78 of the Retro Hangover podcast. I am your co-host, Chris Copleen, with, as always, your host, Shane. Great Worm Prismatic Dick Dragon Koski!
You know, I know it wasn't your intention, but your alliteration for this episode did nothing except make me think of Dunkaroos and how much I miss them, and also that I'm in my 30s and they would probably wreck my colon now.
Everything wrecks our colons now.
Dude, for real. But you know what wrecks things the most? Great prismatic fucking dragons, man.
Worm.
According to 4th edition lore, that shit is like an unstoppable killing machine.
I thought people didn't like 4th edition.
They don't. I don't. But, you know. Listen, there is a silver lining to most really shitty MMO-inspired clouds, and, you know, that can be one of them.
It can be.
Yeah.
Which is fitting, because for this episode, we are talking about, as you've probably already seen on the title card, Dungeons & Dragons video games.
That's right.
This was one of our patron choices. This came from patron Ashton. So thank you, Ashton, for this suggestion. Thank you for this episode. I think this is going to be a little bit more of a tricky one. It's not going to be what you all are expecting. We kind of had to divert from the things we usually do, because this is an episode discussing the kind of the history of the games themselves. So providing a brief history be a little redundant. So you won't be hearing that today.
It's the whole episode.
Yeah, the entire episode is the brief history of Dungeons & Dragons video games.
I would just like to take a moment to highlight the stark contrast between our two premier patrons, Ashton and Lyle. See,
yes,
when Lyle suggests a game for us to cover on an episode, he tries to inflict the most amount of pain by picking something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer for the Game Boy. Whereas Ashton is a lot more like, you know, introspective and thoughtful. And he goes, you know, I'd really like to know more about the history of video games and Dungeons and Dragons and how they are related to one another and how they are inextricably intertwined. And I just want to point that out. And that's a very long-winded and erudite way of saying, fuck you, Lyle. Also, I love you, but fuck you.
You know, I kind of view it as Lyle turning the spotlight to lesser known games that deserve to be known about so we can avoid them.
But we didn't avoid them. That's the point.
Our listeners can avoid them.
It was inflicted upon us.
It wasn't afflicted. You know what? He's doing it for his entertainment. And
I mean, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And and we hope that we can make this an entertaining episode as well. I'm a little afraid that this is going to get potentially too retro naughties. Not naughty. I don't know.
Retro not-esque.
Retro not-esque.
Yeah.
That's my only concern. But we will do whatever we can to make sure that this is a good episode for you, Ashton. We do hope you like it. This is your recommendation. But before we get to the meat of it, Shane.
Yes.
What have you been up to? What have you been playing?
So I have an important announcement to make.
Ooh.
Yeah. I have finally extracted myself from the gachapon daily grind of Dissidia Opera Omnia on my mobile device.
Okay.
It took a lot, but I got there. I've come to the realization, with a little bit of self-introspection that, some people end up getting hopelessly addicted to substances like drugs or alcohol or gamer girl bathwater. And my kryptonite, as it were, I think is games as a service, like ongoing games that provide you with that real sense of like FOMO, the fear of missing out. Yeah, that's what really gets me. And so I don't want to like crap on the game because there's a reason I played it for several years outside of just, hopeless addiction. But like it is a good mobile game. And there's a lot of positive things that I have said about it in the past and that I can say now. And I enjoyed my time with it. I actually genuinely did. It's a good implementation of what it does. The issue though, is I got to a point like last week where I was grinding through summon boards to get points to unlock like character upgrades for the over 100 characters that are in the roster of that game. And I was spending literally hours a day just mindlessly grinding the same boss over and over again for these points. And then at one point in, the week, I just kind of stopped and I was like, what am I doing? And I just hit that like burnout spot. And then the next day, I'm going to be honest, it took a lot for me to not want to just be like, nah, it's the sunk cost fallacy. I've spent so much time on this game. I've built up my roster. Like, I don't want to just give it up. But I forced myself to not play for like a whole day. And then after that, I was like, you know what? I'm good. Like once I broke myself out of that cycle of like needing to compulsively play every day, I was good. So I am free of the
Genshin
mobile
Impact.
Grind. So yeah, but Genshin Impact's not really the same in that way. Honestly, like it doesn't demand nearly as much of my time as like DFFOO does or did
yet.
Yeah, not yet. And honestly, if it gets to that point, I might have to make that same decision, but it's freed up a lot of my gaming time to do other perhaps more productive gaming things like working through my backlog or playing a certain game that we're going to be talking about very soon and things like that. So it's like weirdly freeing. And listen, I'm sure some people that are listening to this probably totally get what I'm saying. And then other people will probably think I'm fucking insane, but
a little bit of both.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my story of mobile gaming addiction, and luckily I didn't drop like thousands and thousands of dollars into the game like some people do. It was more of just like my time that I can never get back. But
you weren't the whale. You were a purpose with a porpoise.
Yeah, I was like a dolphin.
Yeah,
it was a dolphin,
friendly dolphin.
Yeah,
I'm not even going to try and make the sound. I want to make the sound. I can't do it though.
I'm sure the listeners appreciate that too.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, that's kind of the biggest thing is just stepping away from that. Other than that, yeah, I've been putting some time into a game for our next episode after this one, which I'm enjoying and I'm excited to talk about. And yeah, I'm just gonna be focusing on like trying to knock out some more games in my backlog and some of the ones that we have coming up for future episodes in the next couple months too. So good stuff. But what about you? What have you been up to?
So I've been dumping a lot of time into Ogre Battle 64, which is extremely addictive, but it's not horrendously addictive. It's not that mobile game addiction that you were just talking about.
Not gachapon addicting, yeah.
No. It's a different kind of addiction. It's like the Final Fantasy Tactics addiction, if you know what I'm talking about, where you get into a battle and the battle lasts probably about an hour where I'm at in the game. Every single battle lasts an hour, and there's 40 battles. And they can, last over an hour. And then when you're tinkering around with your organized screen, trying to upgrade everyone's class, what they can equip, making sure they're ready for the next battle and everything like that. That can take like 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how much you want to do and how much you want to change. But the good thing is every single time I'm done with the battle, I can just move on from the game. It's like, okay, I got my battle done for the day. And then I don't have to really worry about anything else. And that's what I love about it. Like, the battles are fun. It's really hard to describe. It's you essentially, if you haven't played Ogre Battle before, it's the same as the SNES one, except it's just for the N64 and looks a lot better. But you control little armies and you send them to cities, and they have to liberate cities, and you have to take over the enemy base in order to win the map. And then when you run into enemies, the way that you set up your characters, their classes and formations, they fight against the other enemy unit, but you don't control them. You just set them up for what actions they're going to perform on a 9x9 grid.
Okay.
And you can take up 5 spaces in that grid. So for me, that's just really addictive. Just trying to make sure you send the right units to the right location, making sure you're balancing out your team correctly, making sure that you're keeping everyone equipped properly, making sure you don't have one character that can just run through everybody, which I think is impossible because my main character unit can just flatten everything he runs into, which is kind of problematic, but I'm enjoying it. Other than that, I got my CRT TV fixed, and that was an adventure because I had to call almost every TV repairman in town, and almost every single one of them, except for 2 of them. As soon as I talked to them, like, hey, I'm trying to get a CRT TV repaired, and before I could say repaired, they said, nope, we don't do that. Nope. I'm like, what? They're like, nope, won't fuck with it. Like, what? Why? Oh, it's obsolete. Can't find the parts. Bye. And they're just like, almost immediately hang up. Like, wow. This is like, what? Whoa. So I call this one dude, and he's like, yeah, I'll come out. And I'm like, oh, okay. This is awesome. So he takes a look at it. He replaces some capacitors. Works brand new. Paid a really decent price for it. And he's like, man, they don't make TVs like they used to. These are so solid. These new ones are just, they're a pain in the ass. But they're all module based. And it almost costs more to get the TV repaired than to just get a new one. I'm like, yeah, that's why I'm getting the CRT repaired. Because when I went onto eBay to look at the model I had, I think the cheapest one with free shipping was $300. So apparently CRTs are maintaining their value. So I think everyone who's listening to this who plays retro games and has old retro systems knows how near and dear CRT TVs are to playing the authentic retro game experience. Even Shane, you know this, and because last time when I was at your house when we were hanging out, we were playing Turtles on a CRT TV. There's no replacement for that feeling. There's no replacement in audio and, well, audio probably, but visual quality. You can't get the same. You cannot get the same experience on a flat screen. It's not even close unless you dump serious money into frame meisters and shit.
Oh God, yeah. Well, but you can never truly replicate the warm, comforting, slightly static glow of a CRT TV.
And that buzz.
That's right.
Just always in the background. It's great.
It's why we all have mild tinnitus.
And we're all slightly radioactive. It's not 5G, people. It's the CRT TVs that kept pumping in those radioactive waves into your body. It's the new generation that will free us from the lizard people. We'll be all right.
It's all right. It was worth it.
Totally worth it. You know what's also worth it? Are games based off Dungeons and Dragons. Well, what? Some of them, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, yeah. Some of them.
So here's how we are going to do this, because there's a lot of games here, and obviously me and Shane have not played all of them. Shane plays more D&D in real life. I don't think he plays a lot of D&D video games, though I'm not saying he hasn't played any. We will get to that, certainly. And I don't really play D&D at all, but I've more played the video games. So we'll discuss what we kind of know about, and we'll hit up on anything that's important. But of course, we're not going to go into deep dives here. We're going to try and provide whatever we can with some of these things, because it is important to know a lot of the games that were developed off D&D, because I think we both agree Dungeons and Dragons is probably the most important tabletop game when it comes to gaming, just in general, video games, tabletop games. Any well, not like sports games, obviously, because people who couldn't play sports played Dungeons and Dragons. So
excuse me. I did both. Thank you very much.
well, you did one better than the other one, obviously.
I am a true Renaissance man is what I'm trying to say.
You're right. So we're just going to touch on these. Some of these could have their own episodes.
And they probably will.
So if you don't feel like we're going too in depth with some of these things, one, it's probably we probably haven't played it, or two, we are really going to be holding back for something we love. And I mean, just for instance, like Baldur's Gate, we could talk on and on and on and on about it, but we're going to try and hold back. So I'm going to list some games, and then Shane is going to expound on a couple of them. So I'll list like 2 or 3, and then we'll talk about it if it's important. All right. So Shane, are you ready?
Yeah. Let's walk through the chronology of the D&D video games.
All right, so we're going to start in 1974. I do think we kind of have to talk about 1974 because that was the year that the original Dungeons and Dragons was released, which was a tabletop game, as we have already said. It was an extremely basic game, nothing like what you have today. You had 3 classes and 4 races. And
actually, if I recall correctly, I think some of the classes were races. Like there was some weird crossover there. Like a class was like a dwarf or whatever.
I don't know if that was in the original one or later. I'm not sure. What I saw, there was 3 classes. Fighting man. I'm trying to...
The man who punch good. With also maybe sword. Yeah, I mean, that might have been Advanced Dungeons and Dragons where there was like the weird class race thing or whatever. But point being is that 1974 and 75 was, we're starting there obviously because that's the release of the original D&D game set.
And almost immediately they came out with a game called D&D. It's probably really tiny. It was made by some people out in Southern Illinois University. And they made this game, and I think it's somewhat important.
It is, yeah. So I guess it also was kind of known by the Game of Dragons. I don't know if they subtitled it as that or if it was kind of like an unofficial title, but that was also brought up into the discussion about that game. And it's notable outside of being quite literally on the ball as being the first like video game adaptation, even if it's unofficial, of the tabletop game. But it's also credited as, kind of one of the first non-linear video games, and also one of the ones to feature boss encounters. Because, I mean, you have to keep in mind, this is the 70s, where a lot of video games are still kind of in their infancy. And so I think this might get overlooked a lot of the time, but it is important to note outside of just its relationship to D&D.
It was a text adventure. I have never played it. I don't think many people have.
So it's not really a text adventure in the same way as like a Zork or something like that. It actually did have some very rudimentary graphics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. And by the way, this was not endorsed or licensed by TSR. It was made completely independently of D&D. I mean, it's not even D&D, it's D letter and D.
Yeah. And also on that, we should probably point out that we are going to be touching on some games that were inspired by D&D. And I will go ahead and put the caveat out there right now that there's no way in hell that we could actually cover every single game that was indirectly inspired by D&D because we'd be here forever. But we did want to highlight at least some of the perhaps more notable ones. So we'll point those out as we go along.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about Lord of the Rings, which is probably the most successful franchise based off Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
I know I got that one wrong. I'm fucking with everybody here. Please don't think I'm an idiot.
I mean, you know what? We'll leave that as is. We'll just wait for the rage comments. It's fine.
All right, so then we move on to 76 and 77. So Advanced Dungeons and Dragons comes out at this time, and that's where you expand out into more character classes. I think the races remain the same, but more character classes like your more traditional ones: Paladin, Cleric, Monk, all that crap, Bard, Illusionist. That's when you can start playing as those characters, and you get the 9 character alignments. So that's when Dungeons and Dragons, as we know it today, starts to really develop and starts to really mature. Like Dungeons and Dragons was almost a completely different game. But at this time, we had 2 games that you could argue were at least inspired in spirit by Dungeons and Dragons, with Colossal Cave Adventure and Zork. And do we have anything on any of these, Shane?
Yeah, I mean, not really. I mean, you might say that the claim for inspiration on those might be somewhat dubious, but also keep in mind that, a lot of the elements that we kind of take for granted now, because they're just so, like ingrained in gaming as a whole, really did originate from D&D. So the level of inspiration is perhaps debatable, but we could probably make a pretty solid argument that it is still there. But yeah, not a lot else during that time frame when AD&D came out.
Right. I do think that if you look at text adventures or a lot of early games, role-playing games, quote role-playing games back in, especially computer games made back in that time, it's really easy how anyone could say any of them were inspired by D&D. But keep in mind that there were other tabletop games outside of D&D at the same time. So any of them could be inspired by any of them. We're just saying, hey, if you think these were inspired by it, we just touch on them. They're big games that you can draw a line somewhere, somehow, to Dungeons and Dragons. But I've never played either of them either. So
I played
maybe
Zork.
they have nothing to do with them. Okay.
Yeah. It was a while ago. We should do that on a stream someday.
Yeah.
We'll do a Zork episode.
Yeah, didn't they remake it? Well, I don't want to get too much in a tangent here. Any case,
yes,
1979 I think is a very critical year for video games, role-playing video games, with the release of Akalabeth, The World of Doom.
Yeah, so this one is important because this was developed by, at the time, a teenaged Richard Garriott, who, if you're not familiar with that name, and honestly, you probably should be, he was the one to go on to create the Ultima series. So a very pivotal moment in the history of D&D inspired video gaming. Also, I just want to point out that Akalabeth, The World of Doom, is like the most teenage edgelord title that you could probably come up with.
And by the way, I'm not going to be like Shane. If you don't know who Richard Garriott is, that's completely cool. This was, I mean, holy shit, dude. This is like 41 years ago. So there might not be a lot of people who know who Richard Garriott is, a.k.a. Lord Britain. But yes.
Lord British.
Lord British? I thought it was Lord Britain. Well, even I don't know everything, Shane. It's okay if these people don't understand these things.
Well, all that's saying to me is that we need to bust out, the format of our show that we haven't done in quite some time and cover an individual person. We'll do a Richard Garriott episode. So there you go.
We'll do Richard Garriott. Should be fun. Even though the only Ultima game I've ever played is Ultima Online.
So speaking of Ultima,
this was in 1981. So 1981 had Ultima and Wizardry. And we'll talk about those briefly before we talk about probably the biggest D&D related game of 1981, which I think will surprise most of you. So why are we talking about Ultima and Wizardry, Shane?
I mean, because they're basically D&D, but just without the name. I mean, the inspiration is clearly there. Anyone who's seen anything about any of the Ultima games or the Wizardry games and knows even a passing bit about D&D, you can see that the connection there is pretty clear. There was a lot of inspiration going on there, but honestly, I mean, that it's important as far as the history of just RPGs, but also D&D inspired games go. But I'm just gonna be honest, the next thing in 1981 is far more fascinating to me.
Yes. And with this, we have the very first officially TSR licensed Dungeons and Dragons video game.
What?
And it was...
What system was it for, Chris?
It was a system, technically. It
Holy
was
shit.
I know, it was his own console. The Dungeons and Dragons computer fantasy game, LCD handheld, by not Tiger, but Mattel.
That's right. Mattel, the people who brought you Barbie.
It looks like, well, they also brought you the Intellivision. It makes sense. And we're going to be talking about it in a minute too. But you have, I thought, I don't know how big this thing is, but it reminded me of Digimon back in the day. If you've seen them. So it has 3 buttons, and it's move, attack, and something. It's just 3 buttons, and it's a dungeon crawler. It's a very basic and rudimentary dungeon crawler, but it is an LCD video game where you go through dungeons and you attack bats, essentially in a first-person perspective, bats and skeletons and shit,
and maybe even dragons. I actually don't know.
I
if
have no idea.
You do that or not.
But I think that's incredibly cool. So first of all, it's an LCD game, and that's the first one. They could have gone so many other directions. They probably should have, but
true.
That's really interesting. It's also interesting. The first attempt at making a Dungeons and Dragons video game was an action game and not an RPG. When they had the ability to do it, not so much on home consoles. Because at this point there were home consoles. You did have, the Odyssey 2, the Atari 2600, and the Intellivision were all out this time. I think the ColecoVision was out as well. And you don't really have RPGs on that, but you did have games like Adventure. So you could have done something in that realm. But they went with an LCD action game.
Yeah. I mean, I was not aware of this until we kind of were doing the research for this episode, and I'm thrilled to know that technically the first licensed D&D video game product was an LCD handheld. I also appreciate that on the back of the box it was boasting like over something like 100 levels of gameplay and like something like insane like LCD graphics and all this stuff. I gotta look up a picture of the box again, but it was pretty amusing. But yeah, interesting origins for the first D&D game.
For 1981, that they looked pretty impressive.
Sure,
I'll give them that. I mean, today, they look like
an LCD handheld.
Watch.
Yes,
like an LCD handheld. So moving on to 1982. I think the most important one, I think the first one to come out in 1982 was a different game, but I think this is a little bit more important to talk about before we get to the other one, is the game Dungeon, which is a D&D like spin-off. It was released by TSR. It was based off D&D. It was kind of like D&D side quest in a way. Very much, it was all within the D&D universe, from what I understand. It was made for the Apple II, and it was co-developed by Bruce Nesmith.
Who is Bruce Nesmith, Chris?
He's only the lead designer for Skyrim.
Oh, wow.
Which I found that's interesting when you find out little tidbits like this, when you go back and you find these things in research.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I don't think I heard you point it out, but so in case you didn't, like, this was a board game originally. Yeah. So it's a kind of spin-off thing in board game format. And actually, they made an updated version of this to kind of align with 5th edition as well. I have a copy of it. And it's cool. It's basically like it's like Babby's first dungeon crawl kind of in a way where it's really geared towards like a younger audience, I think, overall. It's got really simple mechanics and that sort of thing.
But when you're really trying to make a D&D video game, that's where you're going to start. So it's almost the perfect game to really use start to establish things based off the D&D rule set.
Right.
So I think that was smart, that was the first way they went with it. I'm really interested that the guy who designed it ended up becoming the lead designer of Skyrim. So that's cool. All right. So later 1982 or earlier 1982, because chronology, they came out with the first Dungeons & Dragons games for a home console, which was called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Cloudy Mountain, and it was for the Intellivision.
Yeah, so the weird thing about this one, though, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but technically it's kind of the first... Well, yeah, outside of Dungeon, which again is just like a digital board game adaptation, this is more or less the first real take on a video game using advanced D&D or really any D&D in general. But the weird thing is that it kind of really just used the name. The gameplay itself doesn't really lend anything to the D&D rule set. It doesn't really leverage much from the D&D content outside of really just the name, which I think is odd. And just going ahead to skip ahead a little bit, it did end up receiving a sequel called The Treasure of Tarman, which again was also an odd one. This was in 1983, but it was an odd one because even though it was a sequel to Cloudy Mountain, it was a completely different style of game where Cloudy Mountain was more of like a, I guess you could say, overhead view, but keep in mind this is the Intellivision, so it kind of is what it is. But
16-bit console,
right? But the difference with Treasure of Tarman is that it was a first-person dungeon crawler, very similar to kind of like the dungeons in Phantasy Star or something like that. So
or Wizardry,
yeah. But interesting to note, at any rate.
Yeah, I do think that's interesting. This is the kind of game that you would pitch to the kids from Stranger Things to buy an Intellivision.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much.
Like, hey, kids, you can play Dungeons and Dragons on your home consoles now. And you get it, like, this isn't fucking Dungeons and Dragons. This is something, but it's not Dungeons and Dragons.
Just
I don't know.
Use your imagination.
Imagination. But, we were better at that back then, so I could see it. But you weren't rolling dice. You weren't playing with your friends.
It was like very loosely fantasy based, and it was kind of like a adventure-y kind of game. I don't know. Yeah. Like I said, though, really the only real line you can draw between the two is just the fact that it was called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Outside of that, it could have been titled literally anything else and it wouldn't have made a difference.
So the next 2 years are really the quiet before the storm.
Yes.
And that's 1986 and 1987. But we do have to talk about them briefly because that is the year or years Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest were released.
Yes.
And this was a tough one. And I would say when you're talking about D&D inspired video games, and this is kind of where this is also kind of the end when we're going to stop talking about non-licensed TSR games. Because this is kind of, everything offshoots from here that's non-TSR kind of takes its own path. This is just what people were playing before they could really play an RPG that was playing by the D&D rule set. And if you want to go with either of these two games and which one is more D&D like, it's got to be Final Fantasy.
Yeah. I mean, we've been talking about this on our Sunday stream since we've been playing through the first one for our fall challenge. And there's a lot. I mean, basically, as far as I could tell, for like 1986/87, I think playing Final Fantasy was probably the closest you were going to get to a D&D recreation, like on a home console.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know how old Might and Magic is. Maybe I should have brought that one up because Might and Magic would certainly fit into it. But by this point, you already had Wizardry. So if you already talked about Wizardry and Ultima, talking about games like Might and Magic is kind of redundant. But then you get into Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, Phantasy Star, the three games, major 8-bit RPGs. Those were definitely inspired. And I think we talked about this on the Phantasy Star episode, how they were inspired by Ultima and Wizardry. Now, the reason I look at Final Fantasy as being heavily inspired by Dungeons and Dragons is the surface level obviousness to it. You have multiple character classes that are selectable from the beginning. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses. They each have their own, statistics that provide those strengths and weaknesses. And the magic casting is almost identical, where you have a certain amount of spells from a spell level you can cast per day, whereas Dragon Quest and Phantasy Star use MP. You have a mana pool. So Final Fantasy completely apes the Dungeons and Dragons magic system. And I don't know if that's the same in Ultima and Wizardry. Yeah. So they just could be aping the shit out of that. And if someone said they ape Ultima and Wizardry even more, I'd be like, that's fine, that's cool. But in turn, Ultima and Wizardry completely aped Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, and honestly, I think the spell slot system that Final Fantasy went with is probably the biggest connection between it and, you know, its Dungeons and Dragons inspiration. Like, that's the most direct one, I think.
Right.
And for better or worse, actually, because I'm gonna be real. Like, we mentioned this, I think, at least once on the stream, that I have never really been a fan of that spell slot kind of system like that. I think it's actually incredibly limiting, and when you put that in a video game, it makes it even worse, in my opinion. So I think, at least in terms of video games, I think the mana pool system that the overwhelming majority of games of this ilk use and have used for years now is, I think, a far superior system just for playability's sake.
All right, so we're about to roll into 1988.
Oh boy.
Shane, do you want a little break so you can throw in some music or something? I don't know. Because this is where it starts to get big.
Yeah,
kind of break up the monotony a little bit.
Yeah, things. This is where things start to really just fucking go from 0 to 60 in like 10 seconds.
So 1988, a little company called SSI, or Strategic Simulations Incorporated, gains the D&D license, and oh boy, would they use it.
Oh boy.
So the first game they would come out with in 1988 was Pool of Radiance. I have not played this game. I'm assuming that you have.
Actually, I have not. I think technically I own it. I think on like Good Old Games or something. But no, I haven't. There's a lot of these older D&D games I have not had occasion to go back and play yet. But this one, interestingly, it was what a lot of people consider to be the first true D&D video game. There were, of course, you know, the ones that we just mentioned earlier that had the official name and the endorsement from TSR and what have you, but they didn't really properly represent the D&D experience. And so a lot of folks see Pool of Radiance as the first real representation of D&D in like a digital space. Also interesting to note is that Pool of Radiance was the biggest game in SSI's history, and that's including anything else they released after. Like, they never topped the popularity of Pool of Radiance. And it was popular enough that it ended up, you know, causing them to come up with 3 more follow-up games in that same series over the course of the next 3 years or so, which was the Curse of the Azure Bonds, Secret of the Silver Blades, and Pools of Darkness. None of those, of course, as I mentioned, really hit the same peak popularity as Pool of Radiance did, but they all kind of performed pretty well in their own right. But yeah, that one is super important. Also, it beat out a lot of very similar competitors in the market at the time, like Ultima 5 and Bard's Tale 3.
That is actually pretty shocking. Well, it is and it isn't. I think this is when... I wouldn't say this is peak Dungeons and Dragons time, but it was right around there. This is the time in the 80s when every mother said that if you played the game, you get possessed by Satan. So,
started getting all of those really great, like, after-school special shock kind of movies.
Yeah. Everyone loves the 80s and the 90s, and to an extent, I do as well. But people forget that part about the 80s and 90s, where the crazy, you know, religious outlook on everything, and how everything would make you a Satan worshiper. And Dungeons and Dragons was one of those things. But that's probably what made it more popular. There's a Streisand effect. So that's probably why it took so long. When you think about it, it really took a long time for D&D to get a fully fledged RPG on anything. 1988, we're talking PCs had... I mean, they weren't insignificant at this point. They could have made a game based off the D&D rule set, or at least saying it was based off the D&D rule set a couple years before this, if you look at PC technology. Definitely not on home consoles, I would say. That's why I say the closest thing you're going to get on the NES and be entertaining is your Final Fantasy, because they did have, of course, D&D license games for the NES. There's no denying that, and the Sega Master System. But this was the time that you first saw something that was just fully developed, fully integrated, and fully understood as a Dungeons and Dragons game.
Mm-hmm.
Much unlike the game Heroes of the Lance, which was released in the same year, which did take place in the Dragonlance setting. I guess that's the way to put it. Dragonlance campaign? I don't know.
Yeah, setting's fine, yeah.
Setting. And as Shane put in his notes, not as good or as popular as Pool of Radiance.
Yeah, so it was also released by SSI, of course, because they had the exclusive license to D&D for quite some time, actually. But yeah, it could not compare to Pool of Radiance. And, you know, part of that is probably just due to the quality of the game, but I would wager that the other part of it is because Pool of Radiance was a much more accurate representation of the true D&D experience, but in a digital format. So if you're that much of a hyper nerd that you're going to be looking for a D&D video game in 1988, you're probably going to want to go with Pool of Radiance. So I can see why that one would have, you know, been lesser received.
And there was a bunch of games based off in the Heroes of the Lance series as well. Now, one of the reasons it may not have been as good as what it was from the developer US Gold, which isn't exactly known for being the best developer of all time. Moving forward, 1989. So, first of all, the most important thing this year is that second edition for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was released. I think second edition is kind of, talking to AD&D nerds, is the most significant step between editions. Am I right or wrong on that?
I would say yes, for a number of reasons, but one of the most important things for this discussion, though, that we really need to point out is that any game that was based on Dungeons and Dragons and held any sort of, like, you know, standard as far as trying to adhere to the actual rule set of the game. And I put that disclaimer in there because a lot of the games didn't really give so much of a shit about the rule set, and they just wanted to set it in the D&D universe. But for the ones that did, it cannot be overstated. D&D 3rd edition was not fully implemented in a game until 2001. So games from 1989 until 2001 were using the AD&D 2nd edition rule set, which includes THAC0, by the way, which is insanity. And we don't necessarily need to go into the details of what THAC0 is and why that's crazy and that it lasted as long as it did. But just something to note. That's a long ass time.
So this is really the second edition is really the bedrock for every popular, well, considering when the popular ones came out, like, it's the bedrock for every popular D&D series.
It is, yeah.
In terms of video
more or
games,
less, yeah.
D&D video game series. Wow, That is crazy.
Right? That's like over 20 years of using the same rule set.
Well, 12.
12? Am I not doing math right?
You said 2001. This is 1989.
Yeah, 1990. Right, 12. I don't know. What is time? Listen, man, when I think of like 1998, I'm still like, oh yeah, that was like 10, 15 years ago, right? So, fuck.
That's the same way I feel about January this year.
Yeah. Anyway, moving on before I get depressed. So yeah, second edition came out in 89, and along with it, there were a couple of titles that got released. As Chris mentioned, there was a sequel to Heroes of the Lance called Dragons of Flame, pretty much the same style, more or less same reception. And there was also one called Hillsfar, where the gameplay, like, oddly centered around just using a bunch of mini games. I guess it was kind of like fucking D&D WarioWare or some shit. But honestly, the critical reception was pretty negative, more or less across the board. They just thought it was really tedious and mostly uninteresting. I feel like watching some of the quick videos of the game, I felt like there might have been some potential there. Like they had lock-picking mini games and like horse riding and stuff like that, but apparently just not implemented very well. But that's really all you got in 89.
I would say the most important thing about Hillsfar is that it was developed by Westwood Studios, who would go on to develop Command and Conquer.
Yes,
but
so
Westwood
they went on
Studios,
to do much better things.
Westwood Studios would make a bunch of Dungeons and Dragons games that were licensed by TSR. So they're no slouch on the Dungeons and Dragons front. But as we all know, or if you listen to our Command and Conquer episode anyway, that Westwood Studios would be more famous for its Command and Conquer series. Okay, 1990. We got Dragon Strike, Champions of Krynn, and Eye of the Beholder. I would say the most important is Eye of the Beholder. Shane, you want to talk about any of these?
Yeah. I mean, Eye of the Beholder is important because I think it was probably the first one to be set in the city of Waterdeep, which if you're a D&D person, you know why that's important. And And Dragon Strike was kind of cool in that it was sort of like a dragon flight simulator almost for the PC version anyway. Pretty similar to Magic Carpet, but like not as shitty. The NES version was more of a top-down shooter, which I think was a downgrade, but hey, it's the NES, so what do you expect?
Okay, moving on. 1991. Death Knights of Krynn, which I think that's a sequel.
It is.
Shadow Sorcerer and Gateway to the Savage Frontier are the 3 games that we probably don't have anything to say about. So before we do that, Shane, do you have anything to say about any of those?
Yeah, no. Death Knights, yeah, it was another follow-up, I think, in the third of 4 games in that Krynn series. And yeah, other than that, not much there, but I think the one at the end is probably the most notable.
Yes, the game called Neverwinter Nights, and it's probably not the one that you're thinking about.
Nope, it's not.
Nope. It's the first graphical, massively multiplayer online RPG.
That's
in
right.
1991.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
Yeah, I had no idea, actually, that this thing even existed until we started looking into this stuff. But evidently, it was offered as part of AOL's subscription service. And if you're listening to this show based on our metrics, you are old enough to remember using AOL. And yeah, so the weird thing is, and I guess this makes sense for the time, but it was originally limited to only 50 players on the server at any given time because, you know, the
50, yep.
The technology just wasn't there. Eventually that grew to 500. But even then, you know, relatively speaking, that's a pretty small number. But at the time, that was a big deal. And over the course of the life of the game, it actually gained a total player base of over 115,000 people, which for an online persistent game in 1991, that's
massive.
Pretty impressive.
That's not just impressive, that's massive. I don't even know if 115,000 people are online in 1991.
They were, and they were all playing Neverwinter Nights.
Yeah, it was Al Gore and his family. That is an old joke. If you get that, I am sorry. If you don't get that, I am also sorry.
He was playing Neverwinter Nights through the series of tubes.
He wasn't vice president yet, so he still had some time, apparently.
Yeah.
1992, Treasures of the Savage Frontier, Dark Queen of Krynn, I can't talk, Order of the Griffin and Warriors of the Eternal Sun, and Pirates of Realm Space.
Yeah, so really the most notable things in 92 were Order of the Griffin and Warriors of Eternal Sun, because it's the first 2 games to be set in the Mystara realm of D&D, and Pirates of Realm Space was important because it was one of the few, as far as I'm aware, games to be set in the Spelljammer setting, which is like this really weird kind of offshoot setting in D&D where it's like all about space and stuff like that. So that's about it for 92.
93, Forgotten Realms, Unlimited Adventure, Eye of the Beholder 3, Dungeon Hack, Dark Sun, Shattered Lands, Stronghold, and Fantasy Empires. About to say Fantasy Adventures. That
you got that FFA on the brain, man.
Yeah. But what's here?
Yeah, so one thing that you're going to notice is that these lists get kind of long in these like mid to late 90s years, and that's because this was that boom of SSI games. And it's arguably the first real, like, I don't know, I would call it maybe like the Silver Age or something, because I don't believe the golden age of D&D comes until a little bit later. But there's a lot that are coming out. There's not necessarily a lot that's notable. I will say that Forgotten Realms Unlimited Adventure is notable in that it was the last game to use the gold box engine that SSI was using to power most, but not all, of the D&D games that were coming out in the late 80s and early 90s. And by this time, the engine was kind of already starting to show its age, so they were going to have to change things up. Other than that, Stronghold was a city building RTS, which was a little bit of a different, change of pace from what you were getting before. And Fantasy Empires was a map-based war game. So again, kind of spicing things up there. But that's 93 in a nutshell, yeah.
Yeah. Notice, again, a lot of these are pretty much using the setting of D&D as opposed to, well, not a lot, but still a decent chunk, and this will persist, are using the setting rather than the rule set, as Shane alluded to earlier. Okay, 1994. SSI loses the exclusive license to D&D, but they still published like 5 games. Of those 5 games, I'll list them really quickly. Collector's editions, so nothing new there. Sequel to Dark Sun, Ravenloft, Al-Qadim, and Menzo Beranzan. Is anything important?
Well, 1994 is just important because SSI lost their exclusivity deal.
That's the most important part, absolutely.
Yeah. So what that ended up getting us was just if SSI gaining that license was like the impetus to get this flow of games coming in the D&D universe, then this was like cracking the floodgates open, because as soon as other folks could get their hands on that D&D license, then we just got a whole smattering of new stuff to come out. But as far as what they released, not a whole lot that was like super notable. Ravenloft Strahd's Possession, which I think was technically the first one to be set in Ravenlofts, and the only reason I'm pointing that out is because it's my favorite setting. So there's that. But, yeah.
There was also Slayer, and that looks badass. I need to look into this.
Dude,
unless it's terrible.
So, okay, I don't know if it's terrible, but I agree. That's the same reaction I had. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but suffice to say that Slayer apparently was not only an exclusive to the 3DO, as far as I could tell, but it is this like weird blend of RPG mechanics and like Castle Wolfenstein like / Doom FPS gameplay that also featured randomized dungeons and enemies and bosses. That to me sounds fucking badass. So I don't know if I need to track a copy of this down and play it somehow, but I'm just hoping it doesn't suck.
I need to check this out.
Yeah.
This sounds like something right up our alley. I would love. I hope it doesn't suck. Maybe Lyle can suggest if it does suck, so we have to do an episode on it, but Slayer looks interesting.
Yeah.
So the one I get the most kicks out of, though, was Tower of Doom. I have played Tower of Doom. It is a fantastic Capcom beat-em-up that was released in the arcades in 1994. And yeah, it's another game that uses the license. It uses the classes and the races of Dungeons and Dragons to make a fun little beat-em-up.
Yeah. Not a lot to say there. Just a really solid arcade game by Capcom.
And just to touch on it so I don't have to talk about it later, in 1996, they released a sequel to it called Shadows over Mystara. And they released both games on the Saturn to make use of the 4-meg cart. And it plays brilliantly there. Unfortunately, it only came out in Japan, obviously, because you had to have a 4-meg cart in order to play it. And the Saturn was a big floppy failure in the United States. So, but you can get it on Steam now if you want to check it out. If you like beat-em-ups, and again, because Capcom made it, I think it makes it that much more significant. Because I just think more casual listeners to the show will recognize the name Capcom. And we'll be like, hey, I need to check this out. And it's quality. It's known as one of the better beat-em-ups that Capcom made that a lot of people just didn't get to play because it was kind of, just jailed off to the American audience.
Yeah, I own Shadows over Mystara on Steam, and I've played it, and it is a lot of fun, especially if you can play co-op.
1995 had Ravenloft Stone Prophet, not Project.
Which is weird, because that was really the only thing that came out in 95. It was like this weird lull, and then you get into 96, and then it picks back up again.
I really don't think D&D was really firing on all cylinders at this time, though. I think that's another thing.
Yeah, we're getting there. We're almost there.
Yeah, and I'm talking about D&D as a tabletop game and as a license and as a brand. It was really starting to wane. Not there yet, but starting to wane. Okay, 1996. We have a bunch more games here. Let's touch on the first one real quick. Dark Sun World Crimson Sands, which, if it was produced today, would have been made by Google.
Yeah. So this was the second attempt at a D&D MMO RPG. It was run by AT&T, of all people, and basically they were trying to ape the success of Neverwinter that AOL had, and big surprise, it didn't. And ended up shutting down about 2 years after it was released. So probably a reason why not a lot of people even knew this thing existed.
If that came out today, would that be EA or Google?
Oof, I don't know. It's a tough call. Maybe Amazon.
No, Amazon sticks with stuff.
They also have a track record of releasing complete shit piles. But yeah, go ahead. Go on.
It falls under everything. There was also the game Death Keep, Blood and Magic. We already talked about Shadows over Mystara, and Birthright, Gorgon's Alliance.
Yeah, just a couple quick points on that. Blood and Magic was an RTS, which was not like particularly great, but frankly was just really overshadowed by the fact that Warcraft 2 was released. Basically, any RTS, I think, coming out around 1996 was lost under the massive shadow of Warcraft 2. And then
Command and Conquer, too.
Actually, that's another great example. And then Birthright Gorgon's Alliance, the only reason that's really notable, it's a turn-based strategy game. The game itself was okay, but the reason that I'm pointing it out is because it is, to this day, the only game that was based in the Birthright setting of D&D. That has never happened again.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting for D&D fans, because I have no idea what you're talking about. In 1997, Magic the Gathering purchases TSR.
That's right. Yes, Wizards of the Coast purchases TSR and absorbs them into the amalgamation of the WotC.
From what I understand, this is and this is just from people I've talked to about D&D over the years.
Yeah, and
this was kind of where D&D started to take a shit. Is when Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I guess. I mean, we're going to get there in a few years here in the chronology, but I mean, you end up getting 3rd edition, and there were definitely some issues with 3rd edition. 3.5 was vastly superior in my opinion, but I wouldn't say it was outright terrible. But I think we're entering kind of, as far as the actual tabletop game is concerned, I think we're starting to enter a very serious lull period that kind of extended for quite some time.
So, in terms of games, you had Descent into Undermountain and Iron and Blood, Warriors of Ravenloft.
Okay, so we need to talk about that real quick. This might be one of those ones that if we can manage to play it somewhere, I'm sure Lyle would love to see us suffer through it, but good lord. So Iron and Blood is a D&D fighting game, much like Virtua Fighter or Tekken, except way fucking worse, and was for the PC and the original PlayStation. I will give them credit for trying to make a different kind of game using the D&D license, but boy, this just gets lumped in with all of those other like attempts to knock off like Mortal Kombat or the more successful fighting games, because it just did not get there.
So what you're saying is they need to make a sequel called Iron and Blood, Masters of Terras Kasi.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Nice. And for some reason you put Diablo.
Yeah, I fucking did. So, okay. Diablo came out in 1997, and of course I would. Listen, I'm pointing out some of the more notable things. You could draw parallels all day long to just a billion different games that drew some kind of inspiration from D&D in some fashion or another. The only reason I put Diablo outside of my own personal bias for it is just that it's a little bit more of like a direct correlation that you could make there, in that it's kind of like an ARPG that I think takes a lot of inspiration from a lot of the elements of D&D. That's all.
Okay, that's fair. You can get your D&D fix with Diablo, I guess.
Yeah.
1998. So this is where you can really start getting your D&D fix.
Yes.
As with playing video games. 1998 is probably the biggest year for D&D games, period. And we've been talking about this whole episode. So this marks the beginning of the Interplay era of games when Interplay got the license to publish D&D games. And they released a banger right off the bat, probably established in the legacy of an entire development studio for decades to come in BioWare with Baldur's Gate.
Oh boy. Yeah, this okay. So you know how I was saying that the previous boom with like SSI and like that stuff was kind of like what I refer to as the silver age of D&D games. This is the golden age. This is where it starts. So 1998 and into like the early aughts. God, they just and which is weird too, because this is around the time that 3rd edition ends up getting released in a couple of years from Baldur's Gate. And while the actual game D&D I think was in its sort of like lull period, like I mentioned, conversely, the video game scene for D&D was just like off the fucking charts.
It was unbelievable. Like, even myself, not a D&D player, got into Baldur's Gate. And one of the things, if you want to listen to our friends over the Region Free Gamers podcast, they did Games of 1998. And this was one of the games they had in their tournament to determine who was the best. And the one little interesting history tidbit they had on this, in the UK, Interplay projected that 0 copies would be sold.
Yep.
They wouldn't sell a single copy in all of Europe. As Shane pointed out in the notes, it sold out its first 50,000 units immediately on release. It was a huge game for Dungeons and Dragons, for BioWare, and I guess Interplay, but they're not around anymore. But certainly BioWare is. So this was a huge game.
Yeah, and it's also notable because it was really the second game that BioWare had ever made. So kind of crushing it on your second outing is pretty impressive.
They crushed it. And we hope to make an episode about this in the future. We won't get too wrapped up in this. We know we're getting long-winded, people. We know you've been here a while. But this is the good stuff.
That's right.
All right. So 1999, Planescape Torment.
Yeah, so under the same sort of Interplay banner, you also had Black Isle, which was BioWare's sister studio for all intents and purposes. And they were the ones responsible for Planescape Torment and a couple of the other ones that we're going to talk about in the next couple of years. But this right here, so Baldur's Gate and Planescape Torment and all of this stuff in like the late 90s and early 2000s are the reason that folks who were playing these kind of games, such as myself at that time, have that kind of like enduring affection for BioWare and Black Isle, even though they're not really around anymore, because they just had this crazy string of amazing games that they put out. It's the same sort of effect that Blizzard had, and turns out most companies, if they last long enough, it's, you know what? It's the Batman thing, right? How does he put it? Like, you either die the hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. It's the same thing here. Most of these companies, like Black Isle, they went away in their prime, and we all remember them very fondly. BioWare, not so fucking much. Same thing with Blizzard. So, you know what? What I'm saying is you should go out in a blaze of glory. Just like James Dean that shit.
Yeah. Blizzard's a little bit different, though. They can still make a good game. BioWare, I mean, it's yet to be seen that they can still make
debatable.
A good one.
But anyway.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Moving on to 2000, we've talked about...
Y2K!
Yes. So the world ended and we're living in the simulation. That's why
right.
Everything is so weird. It actually did end, people. So Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition is released. I think that is the most significant part of 2000. In a way, you also had Baldur's Gate 2, Icewind Dale, and of course you would put Diablo 2 on here.
Of course I would. Okay, just like stop for a second though and think about that like the year 2000, man, if you were a PC RPG fan, you were just like you were just, it was just a constant nut. Just nothing but nut that whole year. Like,
well,
you had
RPG fans in general.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, because Baldur's Gate 2, Icewind Dale, and Diablo 2 all in the same year. Good Lord. And the funny thing is that Baldur's Gate 2 actually, by all accounts, but not all accounts, but by many accounts, was even better received than the original, especially, at least on release. So, man, that's some good stuff all in one year.
That's an incredible year.
Yeah.
And of course, like, all those could have their own. I think we've already kind of talked about BioWare and Black Isle and all those things, but yeah, again, they're just really good games. And, you know, they're obviously candidates for episodes on this show. So 2001, you have expansions for Baldur's Gate 2 and Icewind Dale. You get the console game Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance.
Which I still want to play, just for the record. I need to, it was released for the PS2, I think, also. And I need to get a copy of that because I think that is actually like right up my alley and I've never played it.
I had it a long time ago. I don't know what happened to it.
Yeah.
But also Pool of Radiance returns with Ruins of Mithranor. And this is what you mentioned in 2001, the first time the 3rd edition rule set was used in a video game.
Yeah. So Dark Alliance and Ruins of Mithranor were the first two to actually fully implement the 3rd edition D&D rule set. As we had mentioned, up until that point, everybody was using AD&D 2nd edition. And that includes the Baldur's Gate games and like Icewind Dale and everything like that. And the thing is like, for the most part, because I'll be honest, I was not super familiar with the 2nd edition rule set back in 1998 because I wasn't playing D&D really at that time. I didn't jump in like full force until like 3rd edition or 3.5. But you could play Baldur's Gate and like Planescape Torment without knowing what like Thaco or like any of the other things were in the rule set, and you'd get by okay. But if you go back and look at those now, like it's very clear that they tried to replicate the second edition rule set as closely as possible, because that's all very prominently displayed in those games, and also can be very confusing. So I think a lot of us were happy when we started moving on to third edition.
All right, moving forward, 2002. We had the Iceman Dale sequel, Eye of the Beholder, for the GBA, and Neverwinter Nights, which is a game I think both of us absolutely love.
Oh my god, dude, I played so much fucking Neverwinter Nights. That's going to be an episode all on its own. I don't want to go too far into that, but oh man, this might be a hot take, but my personal opinion, I preferred Neverwinter Nights over Baldur's Gate. I agree.
I agree.
And one of the biggest things, and the reason that Neverwinter Nights was so huge, was because it included the World Builder tool set with the game. So you could craft your own custom shit. You could make your own world with NPCs and quests and all that garbage, and run it on a private server. So you are basically a digital DM. And one of my friends did that. And we actually had like an ongoing, like persistent world of Neverwinter Nights with custom stuff, like on a private server for at least a couple of years. And it was one of the coolest fucking things ever. Like, Neverwinter Nights is so good. Anyway, we should move on, because I'm going to talk about that for like another hour.
I'll just say, like, the thing I love most about Neverwinter Nights is just that was a game that I used to play a lot on deployment. Yeah. Just putting it in my computer and then typing in a bunch of numbers and letters to get past the privacy code, because I didn't have one.
Now
I had a disc. I just didn't have the code. But yeah, a game I absolutely loved, near and dear to my heart. And yeah, we need to move on because we will talk about more of that. So 2003, Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, the tabletop, was released, which, as Shane said, probably fixed a lot of the third edition, and then there was no other editions until fifth edition. So this was active for a long time.
It's like the Crystal Skull. It just didn't exist.
Didn't happen.
Yeah.
But there was Shadows of Undrentide and Hordes of the Underdark, and that was for Neverwinter Nights. Those were expansions. You had D&D Heroes for the Xbox. You had Temple of Elemental Evil for Windows. And you had BioWare releasing the kind of Baldur Gate formula for a game that's not Dungeons & Dragons, but you could tell it came kind of right out of Baldur's Gate with Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic.
Yeah. So one thing you also note here, right, is that you start seeing the release cadence of D&D starting to pick up. Because initially, you had the original, then you very quickly had like AD&D, the first edition, then second edition, and you had a crazy long wait before you got third edition. And then things started to pick back up again. So you got 3.5, which, as Chris mentioned, did remediate a lot of the issues that players had with third edition. And then, so you get a couple of games here. Honestly, they're not particularly notable. D&D Heroes was kind of meh. Temple of Elemental Evil was much better received than D&D Heroes, for the record. And of course, the two expansions for Neverwinter came out like rapid fire after the game came out, because they were like, oh shit, this game is huge, and rightly so. And yeah, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, I threw that on there because it's a BioWare joint, and you can kind of see the beginnings also of what we would come to know, I think, as like the BioWare formula, things that you would end up seeing in like Mass Effect and things like that later on. So yeah, but there was a lot of DNA that got carried over. Like, for all intents and purposes, Knights of the Old Republic is kind of like someone just playing a D&D campaign set in the Star Wars universe, is really the best way to describe it.
Yeah, that is the best way to describe it, really. I mean, they're, like I said, they're essentially using the same formula they got with Baldur's Gate, and they just transferred it over.
Also, Disney, please make a Darth Revan series. Thank you.
Another thing I want to touch on, a lot of these games moving forward, in terms of using the I guess, Wizards of the Coast license at this point, are not very notable games. They're just, most of them are not good, or they're remakes. So I think we're really going to power through the 2000s because even up to today, it's kind of the same thing. Would you agree?
Honestly, yeah, for the most part. I think there's just like a handful of standout things, but from the mid to late 2000s, there just really wasn't a lot to talk about. Like you kind of hit that peak with like Baldur's Gate 2, and then after that, it kind of went downhill. Yeah.
I think it was just everything was living in the shadow of that, and it couldn't compare. And BioWare wanted to move on to bigger and better things, and they should have. And if you can't find another developer to do the same things BioWare was doing for you, it's just going to be a steady, just, series of disappointments.
Yeah.
It's not even a law of diminishing returns. You're not getting the same people.
Yeah, I mean, they're just really, really big shoes to fill.
Yeah. And you got people with tiny feet. That's what they kept doing.
Fucking gnomes.
No, gnomes would make a good thing. It's like they hired fucking hobbits. So we're going to kind of power through this, I guess, unless we find something that really piques our interest. So 2004, you had a sequel to Dark Alliance and Forgotten Realms Demon's Stone. Any of those you want to talk about?
Yeah, Demon's Stone is just kind of notable because I believe, and someone could probably fucking fact check me on this, but I believe it was the first one to have a story written by R.A. Salvatore, which was the author, or is the author, of several D&D novels, most notably the Drizzt Do'Urden series. And also it had Patrick Stewart in there, so, anything with Patrick Stewart can't be that bad, right?
I think he's been in a lot of bad things.
Anyway, moving on.
2005 had Dragon Shard.
It did. Notable because it was the first game set in Eberron, which matters to D&D nerds and nobody else. And it was an RTS with some light RPG elements. That's about it.
Okay. 2006 had D&D Online.
Yeah, so you'd think that this would be kind of big, right? And I guess in a way it sort of is. But D&D Online was a weird beast, man. Like, I tried to play that, and I think part of its failing was it tried too hard to replicate a D&D party-based experience in an MMO. Like, to the point where you could not solo anything in the game. You had to have a group, and when you were in a group, only certain classes of players could do certain things in a dungeon, and if you didn't have that class, it either made it much more difficult or impossible to progress through certain things. So like their stringent adherency to trying to replicate a tabletop experience in an MMO, I think was actually to their detriment. And also they just couldn't compete with WoW. Like, let's be real. I mean, 2006, that's 2 years into WoW's life. It was crushing everything else in the MMO space. And when you had this like weirdly esoteric system that D&D Online was trying to do, it didn't have a chance. For the record, like, it was one of the first MMOs to really normalize the like free to play pricing structure for MMOs that a lot would end up adopting in the future. But honestly, that was just out of necessity because they couldn't sustain a subscription model with, the subscriber base that they had.
Well, this was also the era of launch and fail MMOs left and right. Mm-hmm. You had so many MMOs that just everyone wanted a piece of the EverQuest or World of Warcraft pie. They all wanted that money. They also had a highly lucrative without realizing people can only really focus on one, maybe two. And there's going to be more failures than successes. And I think the most probably best remembered, and maybe up until later at this time, that would probably most align with Dungeons and Dragons in terms of an MMO, if you wanted that fix, would probably be EverQuest.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think you of all people could probably make an argument for Ultima Online too, but yeah.
No, because you don't do classes. You develop a character into being something instead of selecting a class. Ultima Online's a little weird, but it's good. But also released in 2006 was Neverwinter Nights 2, so we had a sequel to Neverwinter Nights. Anything important?
Well, yeah, we don't need to go into depth of that, game. But I mean, like, also Neverwinter Nights 2 was a good game, so
that's a good game.
Should probably point that out.
2007, first expansion for Neverwinter Nights 2 and D&D Tactics for the PSP. I haven't even heard of that.
Yeah, I imagine probably most people haven't, including myself. But, I mean, it was released for the PSP, so, there's that. And then also, it did kind of what D&D Online did and also failed at, which was trying to do a very strict 3.5 rule set interpretation. Maybe a neat idea to be a tactics game set in the D&D universe, but it was terribly executed. So it was just kind of a mess to play.
Moving on. So we have 2 years to cover here because nothing really, I guess not much happened between 2008 and 2010.
Nope.
And the most important thing is nothing happened. Nothing happened.
Yep. 3.5 kept on going strong. No new edition was released at all. We don't need to talk about it.
D&D 4th edition did not come out during this time frame.
Absolutely not.
Okay. So 2011, Daggerdale.
Yeah, so
okay.
This was, well, yeah. So the only reason that we point this out, other than trying to give you an exhaustive list of D&D games, is that for those 2 years, you know, up until like 2010, you didn't really get like anything except for some expansions for Neverwinter Nights 2 and then a bunch of kind of shitty Facebook games. So then 2011, everybody was like momentarily kind of excited because they're like, oh shit, like a real game is coming out. And then Daggerdale came out and it was a third-person RPG that kind of sucked. So it was a letdown.
Right. So in 2012, pretty much everything that came out after this was enhanced editions.
Yes, the beginning of the let's reboot and HD remaster fucking everything.
Actually, yeah, and that was just pervasive in all of video gaming, really, at this time.
Yep.
So Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2 came out with enhanced editions. We've already kind of talked about those, but just know that you can still get these enhanced editions, and they're supposed to be really good.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they're bad. It's just that, I don't know. I personally feel like in some cases there's some HD remaster fatigue that sets in after they just start going back to the well one too many times.
Yeah, it's called the Nintendo Switch. 2013, Neverwinter. I didn't even know this was a thing.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently you did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's another MMO. I have no idea what this is.
Not to be confused with Neverwinter Nights or the other Neverwinter Nights or the other Neverwinter Nights. But right. Yeah, it's just called Neverwinter. It came out in 2013. It is, as far as I'm aware, a purely free-to-play MMO. There might be some sort of subscription thingy you can optionally get, but it's actually good. I've wanted to try it out. I played, I think, in the beta back in 2013. And it wasn't bad then, but they've improved it vastly over time. And the neat thing about it is if you are a D&D fan and you are playing 5th edition now, like most of us are, Neverwinter actually stays up to date with the adventure modules that get released for 5e. So, you know, you get like the Rise of Tiamat or like Dragon Horde. I'm sure they probably have a Ghosts of Saltmarsh thing. So any of the stuff that's been coming out for 5e, they've also been releasing new content in Neverwinter. So that's kind of cool.
Moving on, 2014.
Yes.
D&D 5th edition is released to much elation.
Woo.
3.5's rule has ended.
That's right. We can all finally stop playing Pathfinder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Icewind, an enhanced edition of Icewind Dale comes out. Digital version of Lords of Waterdeep, the board game.
Which is an excellent board game, by the way.
Okay. And Divinity Original Sin, which I'm guessing is heavily inspired by D&D.
Yes. So I pointed out Divinity Original Sin and then its follow-up in a couple of years from 2014 purposefully because of the folks who developed it, Larian Studios. So just keep that in mind because we're going to talk about them again in a couple of minutes.
Okay. And then in 2015, we have a shitty game called Sword Coast Legends. And Pillars of Eternity.
Yeah, so Pillars of Eternity was also important. It was a game that was crowdfunded by Obsidian Entertainment and for all intents and purposes was positioned as a spiritual successor to the games like Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, Planescape Torment, all of those, and was very successful and a really solid game. So if you were someone who enjoyed those games of that era, then this was a modern take on that really held true to, I think, what made those CRPGs of that era as good as they were.
Now, I haven't played any of these games for the record, so I'm glad that you have. 2016, Baldur's Gate Siege of Dragonspear, and I'm guessing this is significant because It's just an expansion to Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition, which is the first content in 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's notable for that and for kind of being the only thing in 2016, actually. But yeah, so it was weird because you don't get this that often. But for what it's worth, yeah, your Enhanced Edition of Baldur's Gate, this was completely new, original content for a game that was basically over 15 years old. So kind of neat.
That is really neat.
Yeah.
So pretty much up until today, there really hasn't been anything except for more enhanced stuff and games that were heavily inspired by D&D. Divinity Original Sin 2, which is big amongst D&D fans, as is Pillars of Eternity 2. I didn't know if you wanted to touch on those anymore. There's games
not really. Outside of those two, I think it's just important to kind of point out there that for those couple of years leading up to this year, 2017 through 19, that was a little bit of like a regression back to the very, very early years that we talked about back in the 70s, where you didn't have many actual licensed D&D games at all. But you did have really notable titles that were coming out that were very, very heavily influenced by it.
So it's almost like just 40 years, it's like a 40-year cycle. Now we're back to, hey, let's just take this material that's been around now for, 46 years and let's continue to make things that we remember and we are inspired by and what reminds us of sitting around a table and rolling dice with other people.
Yeah. I mean, I think these developers kind of just took it upon themselves to be like, listen, if no one is, if Wizards and whoever they want to contract with are not going to be making legit D&D video games, then fuck it, let's do it ourselves. And they did a pretty good job.
Well, they're releasing a lot of shitty games over the past 15 years too. So
I mean, yeah, I mean, unless you're really into mobile idle clicker games, but yeah. Yeah.
And then in 2020, this year, they released Baldur's Gate 3, which I guess a lot of people loved.
Dude, a lot of people have been waiting for that for a long time. I'm purposefully sticking to my guns and waiting for a Steam sale or something because I don't typically buy things new anymore. But I almost made an exception for this. I'm not going to lie. Yeah, from everything I've heard, it's really good. And it's the true follow-up to Baldur's Gate 2. And the reason that I wanted you to keep Larian Studios in mind a couple minutes ago is because they were the ones that got tapped to develop Baldur's Gate 3. They, I think, had originally talked with Wizards of the Coast. I think it was 2014, right around the time that they were making Divinity, about trying to make a licensed D&D game. And at the time, Wizards was just like, who the fuck are you? And also, we don't feel like you're proven enough to handle that license. And then a couple of years later, they released Divinity Original Sin and then the follow-up in 2017. And then it was at that point that Wizards actually came back to them and was like, hey, so we're sorry. Turns out you guys are actually really good at this. Do you want to make Baldur's Gate 3? And they were like, fucking yes, we do. And so that's what we got in this year. So that
we're sorry for making all those hack and slashes.
Yeah. So that brings us up to current year. We did it. We made it.
Yay.
So that's
a lot of games, man.
That I take away from this is that there were far more official D&D video game adaptations out there than I was even aware of.
Yeah,
and also
I thought it was just going to be. I thought it was just going to be a few. I only knew of Baldur's Gate and the other games in the late 90s, early 2000s, because that was my jam. I didn't know of all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Because I always thought that the height of D&D, the real cultural height of Dungeons and Dragons was in the 80s. So I thought if there was going to be the most amount of video games would be in the late 80s, early 90s. So I'm kind of surprised that there are that many games. It's nuts. Some really good quality ones, though, but a lot of shit.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, too, is if you talk to your average video gamer, you're probably going to get the same answers, right? It's the ones that really stand out. It's the Baldur's Gates, the Planescape Torments, Icewind Dale, and to a lesser extent, like maybe some of the MMOs or things like that. And the arcade beat 'em ups. I don't want to preclude that because I think those were pretty notable also. But outside of those, really, for the most part, there were a lot of stuff that I think were just attempted and or maybe like cash grab titles, if you want to be more cynical about it, that just kind of fell to the wayside.
Yeah. Mostly games that didn't understand Dungeons and Dragons and just wanted to attract the audience of people who played Dungeons and Dragons. And it looks like, for the most part, especially after the Baldur's Gates of the worlds, the BioWare and Black Island involvement, that people who like Dungeons and Dragons, they picked up on that shit. I mean, you have to deal with the fact that most people who play Dungeons and Dragons are relatively intelligent, I would say, and they know when they're being suckered into buying something that's not the thing they want to buy. They don't want to buy action hack and slashes, no matter how good the games are or how poor they are, especially. They're just not going to do it. And I think that's the biggest problem that you saw in the late 2000s. And I think that's why you saw so much success and you have so many good memories of, especially with the D&D crowd who played video games with like Pool of Radiance or Eye of the Beholder or those kind of games. And that's why a lot of the games that are lesser known, they are action adventures. They're not RPGs.
Yeah, which is not to say that they're not good. I mean, most of them weren't, but Dark Alliance, for the record, was actually a solid action RPG title. But and it's not to say that you can't do something different with the D&D license, because it's been proven that you can. I mean, the arcade beat 'em ups are a great example. And again, like Dark Alliance is a good one because it's an ARPG, which is not your traditional sort of like character-based RPG, like the party systems and stuff like that. So it can be done. It's just that I think there needs to be a better understanding of the IP in general to really make those things, kind of work. And the more that I think about it, originally I had said it was weird that like the lull of D&D also coincided with the massive boom in like the late 90s of the video games. But that actually makes more sense now that I've had time to think through it, because from like a D&D player perspective, if the game itself is kind of lagging and you're not super into kind of what's going on at the time, like with 3rd edition or like the really far tail end of 2nd edition, then when you have this like, glut of really great video games that come out in a short period of time, I can kind of see why the popularity of the video games shot up while the tabletop kind of dropped off, because we
stayed on the table.
Yeah, there you go, exactly. Because you're kind of trying to fill that void, I think, in some ways. You're like, well, if the game itself is not really that great right now, and I have some issues with it, at least I know I can go and play, Baldur's Gate and get a D&D experience that is good and fun and enjoyable. So I guess maybe that makes more sense. And a lot of us right now are hoping that with the boom of 5th edition, particularly with it becoming as crazy popular as I think D&D is more popular now than it ever has been, just on a general level, thanks in no small part to things like Critical Role and stuff like that. But with Baldur's Gate 3 coming out, I think a lot of us are hoping that this might be the sign of like a new renaissance of D&D video games. Because, I think it's time. Our late 2000s, 2010s, that was a rough time for D&D video games. And so I feel like we might be entering into a new era. At least that's what I'm hoping.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what the future holds. We are starting a new generation of games, and of course the indie scene is bigger than it's ever been. So there's a lot of potential there for a lot of new ideas or a lot of new opportunities. I just think it's going to be more games that are inspired by those old games rather than directly taking the license, but we'll see. Just because I think the indie scene is so explosive now, and it would have to be a big company really to take advantage of it, I think. A Baldur's Gate, I don't know how big of a game that is, but you're not going to see it. Video games rise to the level that you did with Baldur's Gate is what I'm saying. I just don't think that's going to happen anymore. But we'll see. I could be completely wrong. But I think that's about it. Shane, if you have any final words before we wrap this up.
No. I think we did a fine job. We've put down in audio an accurate historical account of Dungeons and Dragons.
as much as you can in about an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So, Ashton, we really hope you enjoyed this episode. This one's for you, man. And we definitely appreciate your patronage. And by the way, if you want to participate in suggesting or bringing a topic to the tabletop, go ahead and go to our Patreon. And we have a tier where you can suggest a topic for a future episode. Every patron gets the vote on episode topics, by the way, so you're never out of it. And just go to bit.ly/rhpatron, and you can check us out there.
And outside of that, I guess other quick couple plugs. We have our merch store, so you can go check that out. I think actually if you order soon, you might be able to get things in time for Christmas. So there is that. You can go over to bit.ly/rhp merch and come hang out in the Discord. It's public. It's open. We love chatting with everybody, and we got a good little community going. So if you want to jump in there and talk about video games or just general bullshit, like that's what we're here for. So you can visit bit.ly/rhp chat and join in on the conversation.
Yeah, come on in. You'll get updates on new episodes, future episodes even maybe, and it's a really good time.
Yeah.
So I think that about does it for us, Shane.
I think so. So, with all of that being said, until next time,
play with your Thaco rollin' dice joysticks.
Shane here with a quick message. The one rule Chris and I have always gone by regarding advertisements is this. It has to be something we use and can personally vouch for. If you know me, you know I love coffee. And Bones Coffee Company has been my go-to for home brewing for quite some time now. Their small batch beans come in an impressive variety of flavors like Mint Invaders from Chocolate Space, or Electric Unicorn, which I swear tastes exactly like Fruity Pebbles. And the best part? No added sugar or calories involved, just natural flavors infused right into the beans themselves. Build your own sample pack of 5 4-ounce bags to find out which flavors speak to you, or jump in head first with full 12-ounce bags. They've even got K-Cups. Step up your homebrew game with Bones Coffee by visiting bit.ly/rhpbones. That's bit.ly/rhpbones.